His insatiable love of exploration led 8 miles away to the shores of Arabia, where he stopped at the male and female islands, so called from the men usually living on one island and their wives on the other. Thence they sailed to the south towards the island of Socotra at the entrance of the Gulf of Aden, which Marco Polo partially explored. He speaks of the inhabitants of Socotra as clever magicians, who, by their enchantments, obtain the fulfillment of all their wishes, as well as the power of stilling storms and tempests. Then, taking a southerly course of 1,000 miles, he arrived at the shores of Madagascar. This island appeared to him to be one of the grandest in the world. Its inhabitants are very much occupied with commerce, especially in elephants' tusks. They live principally upon camel's flesh, which is better and more wholesome food than any other. The merchants on their way from the coast of India are usually only 20 days crossing the Sea of Oman, but when they return, they are often 3 months on the voyage on account of the opposing currents, which take them always southwards. Nevertheless, they visit Madagascar very constantly, for there are whole forests of sandalwood, and amber is also found there, from which they can obtain great profit by bartering it for gold and silk stuffs. Wild animals and game are plentiful. According to Marco Polo, leopards, bears, lions, wild boars, giraffes, wild asses, roebucks, deer, stags, and cattle were to be found in great numbers. But what seemed most marvelous of all to him was the fabulous griffin, the roc of which we hear so much in the 1001 Nights, which is not, he says, an animal, half lion and half bird, able to raise and carry away an elephant in its claws. It was probably the Epiornis maximus, for some eggs of this bird are still to be found in Madagascar. This wonderful bird was probably the Epiornis maximus. This wonderful bird was probably the Epiornis maximus. From this island, Marco Polo went in a northwesterly direction to Zanzibar and the coast of Africa. The inhabitants seemed to him remarkably stout, but strong and able to carry the burdens of 4 ordinary men, which is not strange, he says, for they each eat as much as 5 other men. These natives were black and wore no clothing. They had large mouths and turned-up noses, thick lips, and large eyes, a description that agrees exactly with that of the natives of that part of Africa now. They live upon rice, meat, milk, and dates, and make a kind of wine of rice, sugar, and spices. They are brave warriors and fearless of death. They are usually in war mounted on camels and elephants, and armed with a leathern shield, a sword, and a lance. They give their animals an intoxicating drink to excite them on going into action. In Marco Polo's time, says M. Charton, the countries comprised under the title of India were divided into 3 parts: Greater India or Hindustan, that is, the country lying between the Indus and the Ganges; Lesser India, that is, all the country lying beyond the Ganges, between the western coast of the peninsula and the coast of Cochin; China; lastly, Middle India, that is, Abyssinia and the Arabian coast to the Persian Gulf. After leaving Zanzibar, it was Middle India whose coast Marco Polo explored, sailing towards the north, and first Abassi or Abyssinia, a fertile country where the manufacture of fine cotton cloths and buckram is largely carried on. Then the fleet went to Zayla, almost at the entrance of the Straits of Bab el-Mandeb, and at last by the coast of Yemen and Hadramaut they came to Aden, the port frequented by all the ships trading with India and China. Then to Essia, whence a great quantity of fine horses are exported; Dhafar, which produces incense of the finest quality; and Galatu, now Calicut, on the coast of Oman. Then to Ormuz, that Marco Polo had visited once before when he was on his way from Venice to the court of Kublai Khan. This was the furthest point that the fleet had to reach, as the princess was now on the borders of Persia after a voyage of 18 months. But on their arrival, they were met by the sad news of the death of Prince Arghun, the fiancé of the princess, and they found the country involved in civil war. The poor princess was put under the care of Prince Ghazan, the son of Prince Arghun, who did not ascend the throne when his uncle, the usurper, was strangled. What became of the princess we do not hear, but on parting with Niccolo, Matteo, and Marco Polo, she bestowed on them great marks of favor. It was probably during Marco Polo's residence in Persia that he collected some curious documents upon Turkey in Asia. They are disconnected pieces, which he gives at the close of his narrative, and they form a genuine history of the Mongol Khans of Persia. His travels for exploration were at an end, and after taking leave of the Tartar princess, the three Venetians, well escorted and with all expenses paid, set out on their way home. They went to Trebizond, then to Constantinople, and thence to Negropont, where they embarked for Venice. It was in the year 1295, 24 years after leaving it, that Marco Polo and his companions returned to their native town. They were bronzed by exposure to the air and sun, coarsely clad in Tartar costume, and both in manners and language were so much more Mongolian than Venetian that even their nearest relatives failed to recognize them. Beyond this, a report had been widely spread that they were dead, and it had gained so much credence that their friends never expected to see them again. They went to their own house in the part of Venice called St. John Chrysostom and found it occupied by different members of the Polo family, who received the travelers with every mark of distrust, which their pitiable appearance did not tend to lessen, and placed no faith in the somewhat marvelous stories related to them by Marco Polo. After some persuasion, however, they gained admittance into their own house. When they had been a few days in Venice, the three travelers gave a magnificent banquet, followed by a splendid fete, to do away with any remaining doubts as to their identity. They invited the nobility of Venice and all the members of their own family, and when all the guests were assembled, the three hosts appeared dressed in crimson satin robes. The guests then entered the dining room, and the feast began. After the first course was over, the three travelers retired for a few moments and then reappeared, clad in robes of splendid silk damask, which they proceeded to tear and to present each of their guests with a piece. After the second course, they dressed themselves in even more splendid robes of crimson velvet, which they wore until the feast was over, when they appeared in simple Venetian costume. The astonished guests marveled at the magnificence of these garments and wondered what their hosts would next show them. Then the coarse rough clothes that they had worn on the voyage were brought in, and when the linings and seams were undone, rubies, sapphires, emeralds, diamonds, and carbuncles of great value were poured forth from them. Great riches had been hidden in these rags. This unexpected sight cleared away all doubt. The three travelers were recognized at once as Marco, Niccolo, and Matteo Polo, and congratulations upon their return were showered upon them. So celebrated a man as Marco Polo could not escape civic honors. He was made first magistrate in Venice, and as he was continually speaking of the millions of the Grand Khan, who commanded millions of subjects, he gained the sobriquet of Signor Million. It was about 1296 that a war broke out between Venice and Genoa. A Genoese fleet under the command of Lamba Doria crossed the Adriatic and threatened the sea coast. The Venetian Admiral Andrea Dandolo immediately manned a larger fleet and entrusted the command of a galley to Marco Polo, who was justly considered an able commander. The Venetians were beaten in a naval battle on the 8th of September, 1296, and Marco Polo, badly wounded, fell into the hands of the Genoese, who, knowing and appreciating the value of their prisoner, treated him with great kindness. He was taken to Genoa, and there met with a hearty welcome from the most distinguished people who were anxious to hear the account of his travels. It was during his captivity, in 1298, that he made acquaintance with Pisano Rusticien, and tired of repeating his story again and again, dictated his narrative to him. About 1299, Marco Polo was set at liberty. He returned to Venice, and there married. From this time we hear no more of the incidents of his life, and only know from his will that he left 3 daughters. He is thought to have died about the 9th of January, 1323, at the age of 70. Such is the life of this celebrated traveler, whose narrative had a marked influence on the progress of geographical science. He was gifted with great power of observation and could see and describe equally well, and all later explorers have confirmed the truth of his statements. Until the middle of the 18th century, the documents founded on this narrative formed the basis of geographical books and were used as a guide in commercial expeditions to China, India, and Central Asia. Posterity will concur in the suitability of the title that the first copyists gave to Marco Polo's work, that of the Book of the Wonders of the World. Chapter 5. Ibn Battuta 1328–1353. Ibn Battuta, the Nile, Gaza, Tyre, Tiberias, Libanus, Baalbek, Damascus, Meshid, Basora, Baghdad, Tabriz, Mecca and Medina, Yemen, Abyssinia, the country of the Berbers, Zangbar, Ormuz, Syria, Anatolia, Asia Minor, Astrakhan, Constantinople, Turkestan, Herat, the Indus, Delhi, Malabar, the Maldives, Ceylon, the Coromandel Coast, Bengal, the Nicobar Islands, Sumatra, China, Africa, the Niger, Timbuktu. Marco Polo had returned to his native land now nearly 25 years, when a Franciscan monk traversed the whole of Asia, from the Black Sea to the extreme limits of China, passing by Trebizond, Mount Ararat, Babel, and the island of Java. But he was so credulous of all that was told him, and his narrative is so confused, that but little reliance can be placed upon it. It is the same with the fabulous travels of Jean de Mandeville. Cooley says of them, "They are so utterly untrue that they have not their parallel in any language." But we find a worthy successor to the Venetian traveler in an Arabian theologian named Abdullah el-Lawati, better known by the name of Ibn Battuta. He did for Egypt, Arabia, Anatolia, Tartary, India, China, Bengal, and Soudan what Marco Polo had done for Central Asia, and he is worthy to be placed in the foremost rank as a brave traveler and bold explorer. In the year 1324, the 725th year of the Hejira, he resolved to make a pilgrimage to Mecca, and starting from Tangier, his native town, he went first to Alexandria and thence to Cairo. During his stay in Egypt, he turned his attention to the Nile, and especially to the delta. Then he tried to sail up the river, but being stopped by disturbances on the Nubian frontier, he was obliged to return to the mouth of the river and then set sail for Asia Minor. Ibn Battuta in Egypt. Ibn Battuta in Egypt. After visiting Gaza, the tombs of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Tyre, then strongly fortified and unassailable on three sides, and Tiberias, which was in ruins, and whose celebrated baths were completely destroyed, Ibn Battuta was attracted by the wonders of Lebanon, the center for all the hermits of that day, who had judiciously chosen one of the most lovely spots in the whole world wherein to end their days. Then passing Baalbek and going on to Damascus, he found the city, in the year 1345, decimated by the plague. This fearful scourge devoured 24,000 persons daily, if we may believe his report, and Damascus would have been depopulated, had not the prayers of all the people offered up in the mosque, containing the stone with the print of Moses' foot upon it, been heard and answered. On leaving Damascus, Ibn Battuta went to Masjid, where he visited the tomb of Ali, which attracts a large number of paralytic pilgrims who need only to spend one night in prayer beside it to be completely cured. Battuta does not seem to doubt the authenticity of this miracle, well known in the East under the title of the Night of Cure. From Masjid, the traveler went to Basora and entered the kingdom of Ispahan, and then the province of Shiraz, where he wished to converse with the celebrated worker of miracles, Magd Aden. From Shiraz he went to Baghdad, to Tabriz, then to Medina, where he prayed beside the tomb of the Prophet, and finally to Mecca, where he remained 3 years. It is well known that from Mecca, caravans are continually starting for the surrounding country, and it was in company with some of these bold merchants that Ibn Battuta was able to visit the towns of Yemen. He went as far as Aden, at the mouth of the Red Sea, and embarked for Zayla, one of the Abyssinian ports. He was now once more on African ground, and advanced into the country of the Berbers, that he might study the manners and customs of those dirty and repulsive tribes. He found their diet consisted wholly of fish and camel's flesh. But in the town of Makdisbu, there was an attempt at comfort and civilization, presenting a most agreeable contrast with the surrounding squalor. The inhabitants were very fat, each of them, to use Ibn's own expression, eating enough to feed a convent. They were very fond of delicacies, such as plantains boiled in milk, preserved citrons, pods of fresh pepper, and green ginger. After seeing all he wished of the country of the Berbers, chiefly on the coast, he resolved to go to Zangbar, and then, crossing the Red Sea and following the coast of Arabia, he came to Zafar, a town situated upon the Indian Ocean. The vegetation of this country is most luxuriant, the betel, coconut, and incense trees forming their great forests. Still the traveler pushed on and came to Ormuz on the Persian Gulf, and passed through several provinces of Persia. We find him a second time at Mecca in the year 1332, 3 years after he had left it. But this was only to be a short rest for the traveler, for now, leaving Asia for Africa, he went to Upper Egypt, a region but little known, and thence to Cairo. He next visited Syria, making a short stay at Jerusalem and Tripoli, and thence he visited the Turkomans of Anatolia, where the confraternity of young men gave him a most hearty welcome. After Anatolia, the Arabian narrative speaks of Asia Minor. Ibn Battuta advanced as far as Erzurum, where he was shown an aerolite weighing 620 pounds. Then, crossing the Black Sea, he visited the Crimea, Kaffa, and Bulgar, a town of sufficiently high latitude for the unequal length of day and night to be very marked. And at last, he reached Astrakhan, at the mouth of the Volga, where the Khan of Tartary lived during the winter months. The Princess Baylan, the wife of the Khan and daughter of the Emperor of Constantinople, was wishing to visit her father, and it was an opportunity not to be lost by Ibn Battuta for exploring Turkey in Europe. He gained permission to accompany the princess, who set out, attended by 5,000 men and followed by a portable mosque, which was set up at every place where they stayed. The princess's reception at Constantinople was very magnificent, the bells being rung with such spirit that he says, even the horizon seemed full of the vibration. The welcome given to the theologian by the princes of the country was worthy of his fame. He remained in the city 36 days, so that he was able to study it in all its details. This was a time when communication between the different countries was both dangerous and difficult, and Ibn Battuta was considered a very bold traveler. Egypt, Arabia, Turkey, and Asia, the Caucasian provinces had all in turn been explored by him. After such hard work, he might well have taken rest and been satisfied with the laurels that he had gained, for he was without doubt the most celebrated traveler of the 14th century, but his insatiable passion for traveling remained, and the circle of his explorations was still to widen considerably. On leaving Constantinople, Ibn Battuta went again to Astrakhan. Thence crossing the sandy wastes of the present Turkestan, he arrived at Kaverzan, a large populous town, then at Bakhara, half destroyed by the armies of Genghis Khan. Some time after we hear of him at Samarkand, a religious town which greatly pleased the learned traveler, and then at Balkh, which he could not reach without crossing the desert of Khorasan. This town was all in ruins and desolate, for the armies of the barbarians had been there, and Ibn Battuta could not remain in it, but wished to go westward to the frontier of Afghanistan. The mountainous country, near the Hindu Kush range, confronted him, but this was no barrier to him, and after great fatigue, which he bore with equal patience and good humor, he reached the important town of Herat. This was the most westerly point reached by the traveler. He now resolved to change his course for an easterly one, and in going to the extreme limits of Asia, to reach the shores of the Pacific. If he could succeed in this, he would pass the bounds of the explorations of the celebrated Marco Polo. He set out, and following the course of the river Kabul and the frontiers of Afghanistan, he came to the Sindhu, the modern Indus, and descended it to its mouth. From the town of Lahore, he went to Delhi, which great and beautiful city had been deserted by its inhabitants, who had fled from the Emperor Mohammed. This tyrant, who was occasionally both generous and magnificent, received the Arabian traveler very well, made him a judge in Delhi, and gave him a grant of land with some pecuniary advantages that were attached to the post. But these honors were not to be of any long duration, for Ibn Battuta, being implicated in a pretended conspiracy, thought it best to give up his place and make himself a fakir to escape the emperor's displeasure. Mohammed, however, pardoned him and made him his ambassador to China. Fortune again smiled upon the courageous traveler, and he had now the prospect of seeing these distant lands under exceptionally good and safe circumstances. He was charged with presents for the Emperor of China, and horse soldiers were given him as an escort. But Ibn Battuta had not thought of the insurgents who occupied the surrounding countries. A skirmish took place between the escort and the Hindus, and the traveler, being separated from his companions, was taken prisoner, robbed, garroted, and carried off he knew not whither, but his courage and hopefulness did not forsake him, and he contrived to escape from the hands of these robbers. After wandering about for 7 days, he was received into his house by a Negro, who at length led him back to the emperor's palace at Delhi. Mohammed fitted out another expedition, and again appointed the Arabian traveler as his ambassador. This time they passed through the enemy's country without molestation, and by way of Kanauj, Mersa, Gwalior, and Bahran, they reached Malabar. Some time after, they arrived at the great port of Calicut, an important place which became afterwards the chief town of Malabar. Here they were detained by contrary winds for 3 months, and made use of this time to study the Chinese mercantile marine which frequented this port. Ibn speaks with great admiration of these junks, which are like floating gardens, where ginger and herbs are grown on deck. They are each like a separate village, and some merchants were the possessors of a great number of these junks. At last the wind changed. Ibn Battuta chose a small junk well fitted up to take him to China, and had all his property put on board. 13 other junks were to receive the presents sent by the King of Delhi to the Emperor of China, but during the night a violent storm arose, and all the vessels sank. Fortunately for Ibn, he had remained on shore to attend the service at the mosque, and thus his piety saved his life, but he had lost everything except the carpet which he used at his devotions. After this second misfortune, he could not make up his mind to appear before the King of Delhi. This catastrophe was enough to weary the patience of a more long-suffering emperor than Mohammed. Ibn soon made up his mind what to do. Leaving the service of the emperor and the advantages attaching to the post of ambassador, he embarked for the Maldive Islands, which were governed by a woman, and where a large trade in cocoa was carried on. Here he was again made a judge, but this was only of short duration, for the vizier became jealous of his success, and after marrying 3 wives, Ibn was obliged to take refuge in flight. He hoped to reach the Coromandel coast, but contrary winds drove his vessel towards Ceylon, where he was very well received, and gained the king's permission to climb the sacred mountain of Serendid, or Adam's Peak. His object was to see the wonderful impression of a foot at the summit, which the Hindus call Buddha's, and the Mahometans Adam's foot. He pretends in his narrative that this impression measures 11 hands in length, a very different account from that of an historian of the 9th century, who declared it to be 79 cubits long. This historian also adds that while one of the feet of our forefather rested on the mountain, the other was in the Indian Ocean. Ibn Battuta speaks also of large bearded apes, forming a considerable item in the population of the island, and said to be under a king of their own, crowned with leaves. We can give what credit we like to such fables as these, which were propagated by the credulity of the Hindus. From Ceylon, the traveler made his way to the Coromandel coast, but not without experiencing some severe storms. He crossed to the other side of the Indian peninsula and again embarked. Ibn Battuta's vessel was seized by pirates. Ibn Battuta's vessel was seized by pirates. But his vessel was seized by pirates, and Ibn Battuta arrived at Calicut almost without clothes, robbed, and worn out with fatigue. No misfortune could damp his ardor. His was one of those great spirits which seem only invigorated by trouble and disasters. As soon as he was enabled by the kindness of some Delhi merchants to resume his travels, he embarked for the Maldive Islands, went on to Bengal, there set sail for Sumatra, and disembarked at one of the Nicobar Islands after a very bad passage, which had lasted 50 days. 15 days afterwards, he arrived at Sumatra, where the king gave him a hearty welcome and furnished him with means to continue his journey to China. A junk took him in 71 days to the port Kailuka, capital of a country somewhat problematical, of which the brave and handsome inhabitants excelled in making arms. From Kailuka, Ibn passed into the Chinese provinces and went first to the splendid town of Zaitum, probably the present Xiantiqiu of the Chinese, a little to the north of Nankin. He passed through various cities of this great empire, studying the customs of the people and admiring everywhere the riches, industry, and civilization that he found, but he did not get as far as the Great Wall, which he calls the obstacle of Gog and Magog. It was while he was exploring this immense tract of country that he made a short stay in the city of Tichensi, which is composed of 6 fortified towns standing together. It happened that during his wanderings he was able to be present at the funeral of a Khan, who was buried with 4 slaves, 6 of his favorites, and 4 horses. In the meanwhile, disturbances had occurred at Zatum, which obliged Ibn to leave this town, so he set sail for Sumatra, and then after touching at Calicut and Ormuz, he returned to Mecca in 1348, having made the tour of Persia and Syria. But the time of rest had not yet come for this indefatigable explorer. The following year he revisited his native place Tangier, and then after traveling in the southern countries of Europe, he returned to Morocco, went to Soudan and the countries watered by the Niger, crossed the Great Desert, and entered Timbuktu, thus making a journey which would have rendered illustrious a less ambitious traveler. This was to be his last expedition. In 1353, 29 years after leaving Tangier for the first time, he returned to Morocco and settled at Fez. He has earned the reputation of being the most intrepid explorer of the 14th century and well merits to be ranked next after Marco Polo, the illustrious Venetian. Chapter 6. Jean de Bethencourt, 1339–1425. 1. The Norman cavalier, his ideas of conquest, what was known of the Canary Islands, Cadiz, the Canary Archipelago, Graciosa, Lanzarote, Forteventura. Jean de Bethencourt returns to Spain, revolt of Berneville, his interview with King Henry Roman III. Gadifer visits the Canary Archipelago, Canary Island, or Gran Canaria, Faroe Island, Palma Island. Jean de Bethencourt was born about the year 1339 at Eu in Normandy. He was of good family and Baron of St. Martin-le-Gaillard, and had distinguished himself both as a navigator and warrior. He was made chamberlain to Charles Roman VI, but his tastes were more for traveling than a life at court. He resolved to make himself a still more illustrious name by further conquests, and soon an opportunity offered for him to carry out his plans. Jean de Bethencourt. Jean de Bethencourt. On the coast of Africa, there is a group of islands called the Canaries, which were once known as the Fortunate Islands. Juba, a son of one of the Numidian kings, is said to have been their first explorer, about the year of Rome 776. In the Middle Ages, according to some accounts, Arabs, Genoese, Portuguese, Spaniards, and Biscayans had partially visited this interesting group of islands. In 1393, a Spanish gentleman named Almonaster, who was commanding an expedition, succeeded in landing on Lanzarote, one of these islands, and brought back with several prisoners some produce which was a sufficient guarantee of the fertility of this archipelago. The Norman cavalier now found the opening that he sought, and he determined to conquer the Canary Islands and try to convert the inhabitants to the Catholic faith. He was as intelligent, brave, and full of resources as he was energetic, and leaving his house of Grainville-la-Teinturière at Cox, he went to La Rochelle, where he met the Chevalier Gadifer de la Salle, and having explained his project to him, they decided to go to the Canary Islands together. Jean de Bethencourt, having collected an army and made his preparations, and had vessels fitted out and manned, Gadifer and he set sail. After experiencing adverse winds on the way to the Isle de Ré and being much harassed by the constant dissensions on board, they arrived at Vivero and then at Corunna. Here they remained 8 days, then set sail again, and doubling Cape Finisterre, followed the Portuguese coast to Cape St. Vincent and arrived at Cadiz, where they made a longer stay. Here Bethencourt had a dispute with some Genoese merchants who accused him of having taken their vessel, and he had to go to Seville, where King Henry Roman III heard his complaint and acquitted him from all blame. On his return to Cadiz, he found part of his crew in open mutiny, and some of his sailors so frightened that they refused to continue the voyage. So the Chevalier sent back the cowardly sailors and set sail with those who were more courageous. The vessel in which Jean de Bethencourt sailed was becalmed for 3 days. Then, the weather improving, he reached the island of Graciosa, one of the smaller of the Canary group, in 5 days, and then the larger island of Lanzarote, which is nearly the same size as the island of Rhodes. Lanzarote has excellent pasturage and arable land, which is particularly good for the cultivation of barley. Its numerous fountains and cisterns are well supplied with excellent water. The orchilla, which is so much used in dyeing, grows abundantly here. The inhabitants of this island, who as a rule wear scarce any clothing, are tall and well-made, and the women, who wear leathern greatcoats reaching to the ground, are very good-looking and honest. The traveler, prior to disclosing his plans of conquest, wished to possess himself of some of the natives, but his ignorance of the country made this a difficult matter, so, anchoring under the shelter of a small island in the archipelago, he called a meeting of his companions to decide upon a plan of action. They all agreed that the only thing to be done was to take some of the natives by fair means or foul. Guardafia, the king of the island, treated Bethencourt more as a friend than a subject. A castle, or rather fort, was built at the southwestern extremity of the island, and some men left there under the command of Berthun de Berneville, while Bethencourt set out with the rest of his followers for the island of Urbania or Forteventura. Gadifer counseled a debarkation by night, which was done, and then he took the command of a small body of men and scoured the island with them for 8 days without meeting one native, they having all fled to the mountains. Provisions failing, Gadifer was forced to return, and he went to the island of Lobos between Lancerota and Forteventura. But there his chief sailor mutinied, and it was not without difficulty that Gadifer and Bethencourt reached the fort on Lancerota. Bethencourt resolved to return to Spain to get provisions and a new contingent of soldiers, for his crew he could not depend upon. So he left Gadifer in command and set sail for Spain in one of Gadifer's ships. It will be remembered that Berthun de Berneville had been left in command of the fort on Lancerota Island. Unfortunately, he was Gadifer's bitter enemy, and no sooner had Bethencourt set out than he tried to poison the minds of Gadifer's men against him. He succeeded in inducing some, especially the Gascons, to revolt against the governor, who, quite innocent of Berneville's base designs, was spending his time hunting sea-wolves on the island of Lobos with Ramonet de Levedon and several others. Ramonet, having been sent to Lancerota for provisions, found no Berneville there, he having deserted the island with his accomplices for a port on Graziosa, where a coxswain, deceived by his promises, had placed his vessel at his disposal. From Graziosa, the traitor Berneville returned to Lancerota and put the finishing stroke to his villainy by pretending to make an alliance with the king of the island. The king, thinking that no officer of Bethencourt's, in whom he had implicit confidence, could deceive him, came with 24 of his subjects to see Berneville, who seized them when asleep, had them bound, and then carried them off to Graziosa. The king managed to break his bonds, set 3 of his men free, and succeeded in escaping, but the remainder of his unfortunate companions were still prisoners, and Berneville gave them up to some Spanish thieves, who took them away to sell in a foreign land. Berneville's evil deeds did not stop here. By his order, the vessel that Gadifer had sent to the fort at Lancerota was seized. Ramonet tried resistance, but his numbers were too small, and his supplications were useless to prevent Berneville's men, and even Berneville himself, from destroying all the arms, furniture, and goods which Bethencourt had placed in the fort at Lancerota. Insults were showered upon the governor, and Berneville cried, "I should like Gadifer de la Salle to know that if he were as young as I would kill him, but as he is not, I will spare him. If he is put above me, I shall have him drowned, and then he can fish for sea-wolves." Meanwhile, Gadifer and his 10 companions were in danger of perishing on the island of Lobos for want of food and fresh water. But happily, the 2 chaplains of the fort of Lancerota had gone to Graziosa and met the coxswain who had been the victim of Berneville's treason, and he sent one of his men named Ximenes with them back to Lancerota. There they found a small boat which they filled with provisions, and embarking with 4 men who were faithful to Gadifer, they succeeded in reaching Lobos 4 leagues off after a most dangerous passage. Gadifer and his companions were suffering fearfully from hunger and thirst, when Ximenes arrived just in time to save them from perishing, and the governor, learning Berneville's treachery, embarked in the boat for Lancerota as soon as he was a little restored to health. He was grieved at Berneville's conduct towards the poor islanders whom Bethencourt and he had sworn to protect. No, he never could have expected such wickedness in one who was looked upon as the most able of the whole band. But what was Berneville doing meanwhile? After having betrayed his master, he did the same to the companions who had aided him in his evil deeds. He had 12 of them killed, and then he set out for Spain to rejoin Bethencourt and make his own case good, by representing all that had happened in his own way. It was to his interest to get rid of inconvenient witnesses, and therefore he abandoned his companions. These unfortunate men at first meditated imploring the pardon of the governor. They confessed all to the chaplains, but then, fearing the consequences of their deeds, they seized a boat and fled towards Morocco. The boat reached the coast of Barbary, where 10 of the crew were drowned and the 2 others taken for slaves. While all this was happening at Lancerota, Bethencourt arrived at Cadiz, where he took strong measures against his mutinous crew and had the ringleaders imprisoned. Then he sent his vessel to Seville, where King Henry Roman III was at that time, but the ship sank in the Guadalquivir, a great loss to Gadifer, her owner. Bethencourt, having arrived at Seville, met a certain Francis Cave, who had lately come from the Canaries, and who offered to return thither with all the things needed by the governor. But Bethencourt could not agree to this proposal before he had seen the king. Just at this time, Bourneville arrived with some of his accomplices and some islanders whom he intended to sell as slaves. He hoped to be able to deceive Bethencourt, but he had not reckoned upon a certain Courtil who was with him, who lost no time in denouncing the villainy of Bourneville, and on whose word the traitors were all imprisoned at Cadiz. Courtil also told of the treatment that the poor islanders had received. As Bethencourt could not leave Seville till he had had an audience with the king, he gave orders that they should receive every kindness, but while these preliminaries were being concluded, the vessel that contained them was taken to Aragon, and they were sold for slaves. Bethencourt obtained the audience that he sought with the King of Castile, and after telling him the result of his expedition, he said, "Sire, I come to ask your assistance and your leave to conquer the Canary Islands for the Catholic faith. And as you are king and lord of all the surrounding country and the nearest Christian king to these islands, I beg you to receive the homage of your humble servant." The king was very gracious to him and gave him dominion over these islands, and beyond this, 1/5 of all the merchandise that should be brought from them to Spain. He gave H0 maravedis, about 600 L, to buy all that he needed, and also the right to coin money in the Canary Islands. Most unfortunately, these 20,000 maravedis were confided to the care of a dishonest man who fled to France, carrying the money with him. However, Henry Roman III gave Bethencourt a well-rigged vessel manned by 80 men and stocked with provisions, arms, and he was most grateful for this fresh bounty, and sent Gadifer an account of all that had happened, and his extreme disappointment and disgust at Bourneville's conduct, in whom he had so much confidence, announcing at the same time the speedy departure of the vessel given by the King of Castile. Plan of Jerusalem. Plan of Jerusalem. But meanwhile very serious troubles had arisen on Lancerota. King Guardafia was so hurt at Bourneville's conduct that he had revolted, and some of Gadifer's companions had been killed by the islanders. Gadifer insisted upon these subjects being punished, when one of the king's relations named Ake came to him proposing to dethrone the king and put himself in his place. This Ake was a villain who, after having betrayed his king, proposed to betray the Normans and to chase them from the country. Gadifer had no suspicion of his motives. Wishing to avenge the death of his men, he accepted Ake's proposal, and a short time afterwards, on the vigil of St. Catherine's Day, the king was seized and conveyed to the fort in chains. Some days afterwards, Ake, the new king of the island, attacked Gadifer's companions, mortally wounding several of them, but the following night Guardafia, having made his escape from the fort, seized Ake, had him stoned to death, and his body burnt. The governor, Gadifer, was so grieved by these scenes of violence, which were renewed daily, that he resolved to kill all the men on the island, and save only the women and children, whom he hoped to have baptized. But just at this time, the vessel that Bethencourt had freighted for the governor arrived, and brought besides the 80 men, provisions, and a letter which told him, among other things, that Bethencourt had done homage to the King of Castile for the Canary Islands. The governor was not well pleased at this news, for he thought that he ought to have had his share in the islands, but he concealed his displeasure and gave the newcomers a hearty welcome. The arms were at once disembarked, and then Gadifer went on board the vessel to explore the neighboring islands. Remanit and several others joined him in this expedition, and they took 2 of the islanders with them to serve as guides. They arrived safely at Forteventura Island. A few days after landing on the island, Gadifer set out with 35 men to explore the country. But soon the greater part of his followers deserted him, only 13 men, including 2 archers, remaining with him. But he did not give up his project. After wading through a large stream, he found himself in a lovely valley shaded by numberless palm trees. Here, having rested and refreshed himself, he set out again and climbed a hill. At the summit he found about 50 natives who surrounded the small party and threatened to murder them. Gadifer and his companions showed no signs of fear and succeeded in putting their enemies to flight. By the evening, they were able to regain their vessel, carrying away 4 of the native women as prisoners. Gadifer found himself in a lovely valley. Gadifer found himself in a lovely valley. The next day, Gadifer left the island and went to the Gran Canaria island, anchoring in a large harbor lying between Telde and Argony. 500 of the natives confronted them, but apparently with no hostile intentions. They gave them some fish hooks and old iron in exchange for some of the natural productions of the island, such as figs and dragon's blood, a resinous substance taken from the dragon tree, which has a very pleasant balsamic odor. The natives were very much on their guard with the strangers. For 20 years before this, some of Captain Lopez's men had invaded the island, so they would not allow Gadifer to land. The governor was obliged to weigh anchor without exploring the island. He went to Faroe Island and, coasting along it, arrived next at Gomera. It was night, and the sailors were attracted by the fires that the natives had lighted on the shore. When day broke, Gadifer and his companions wished to land, but the islanders would not allow them to proceed when they reached the shore and drove them back to their vessel. Much disappointed by his reception, Gadifer determined to make another attempt at Faroe Island. There he found that he could land without opposition, and he remained on the island 22 days. The interior of the island was very beautiful. Pine trees grew in abundance, and clear streams of water added to its fertility. Quails were found in large numbers, as well as pigs, goats, and sheep. From this fertile island, the party of explorers went to Palma and anchored in a harbor situated to the right of a large river. This is the furthest island of the Canary group. It is covered with pine and dragon trees. From the abundance of fresh water, the pasturage is excellent, and the land might be cultivated with much profit. Its inhabitants are a tall, robust race, well-made, with good features and very white skin. Gadifer remained a short time on this island. On leaving it, he spent 2 days and 2 nights sailing round the other islands and then returned to the fort on Lancerota. They had been absent 3 months. In the meantime, those of the party who had been left in the fort had waged a petty war with the natives and had made a great number of prisoners. The Canarians, demoralized, now came daily to cast themselves on their mercy and to pray for the consecration of baptism. Gadifer was so pleased to hear of this that he sent one of his companions to Spain to inform Bethencourt of the state of the colony. Chapter 2. Jean de Bethencourt. The return of Jean de Bethencourt, Gadifer's jealousy. Bethencourt visits his archipelago. Gadifer goes to conquer Gran Canaria. Disagreement of the 2 commanders. Their return to Spain. Gadifer blamed by the king. Return of Bethencourt. The natives of Forteventura are baptized. Bethencourt revisits Cox. Returns to Lancerota. Lands on the African coast. Conquest of Gran Canaria, Faroe, and Palma Islands. Maciot appointed governor of the archipelago. Bethencourt obtains the Pope's consent to the Canary Islands being made an episcopal see. His return to his country and his death. The envoy had not reached Cadiz when Bethencourt landed at the fort on Lancerota. Gadifer gave him a hearty welcome, and so did the Canary Islanders who had been baptized. A few days afterwards, King Gardafia came and threw himself on their mercy. He was baptized on the 20th of February, 1404, with all his followers. Bethencourt's chaplains drew up a very simple form of instruction for their use, embracing the principal elements of Christianity: the creation, Adam and Eve's fall, the history of Noah, the lives of the patriarchs, the life of our Savior and his crucifixion by the Jews, finishing with an exhortation to believe the 10 Commandments, the holy sacrament of the altar, Easter, confession, and some other points. Bethencourt was an ambitious man, not content with having explored, and so to speak, gained possession of the Canary Islands. He desired to conquer the African countries bordering on the ocean. This was his secret wish in returning to Lancerota, and meanwhile, he had full occupation in establishing his authority in these islands, of which he was only the nominal sovereign. He gave himself wholly to the task, and first visited the islands which Gadifer had explored.